Good morning, grade fours. I hope you're enjoying a lovely Easter weekend. It's time to carry on reading our story of Esio Trot. I've got to be very careful this morning that I don't jump up and down too much because, as you can see, I'm on my trampoline. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. "Your slave for life," he kept repeating to himself. What bliss! But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them all together. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. Now, to you and me, there is not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in the color of their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker shelled tortoises for his big collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's 13 ounces, others a great deal more. But he didn't want any that weighed less. "Feed them cabbage leaves," the pet shop owners told him. "That's all they'll need, and a bowl of water." When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home, all of them in baskets, about 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips. Boy, was he exhausted at the end. But he thought to himself, boy, this is going to be worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room was when all of the 140 tortoises were on his carpet floor. The floor was swarming with tortoises of all different sizes. Some were walking slowly and exploring, some were munching cabbage leaves, others drinking waters. They made just the faint rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet. But that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to tread carefully on his toes between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. He had a job to be getting on with. You see, before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage. Now he went back to his old place of work and asked all his friends if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This wasn't a very difficult thing for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First he made 2 metal claws, or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down the inside of the tube and connected them to the metal claws. You see, it was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Now, Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on that first exciting afternoon, after he made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He leaned over the balcony railings and with his now called tortoise catcher, he lowered it down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. Alfie was basking in the sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You're about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. The claws tightly closed around the shell like 2 fingers of a hand, and he hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. Oh, it was so easy. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales, just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, He picked his way carefully through his huge collections of tortoises to find one, first of all, that had the same color and weighed exactly the same as Elfie, but just 2 ounces more. Now, 2 ounces is not much. It's actually less than what a small hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only by a tiny bit. The difference would have to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't even notice it. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly, no more and no less. He managed to find one. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony, gripped it in the claws of his tortoise catcher, and lowered it down back onto Mrs. Silver's balcony, right beside a nice fresh lettuce. Now tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and chomped away at it with great gusto. Then there followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to come back from work. Would she notice any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a very tense moment.